He accidentally enlarged alien girl's coconuts, and she couldn't stop blushing. Commander Richard Rick O'Gorman wiped the sweat from his brow as he made his way through the winding corridors of Outpost Epsilon-9, the remote research station orbited a gas giant in the Proxima Center system, far from Earth's watchful eyes, the perfect place for experimental research that might raise eyebrows back. Home another day in paradise, he muttered, flexing his muscular arms. The combat he wore left his biceps exposed, a practical choice, given the station's inconsistent environmental controls, though the female staff, both human and alien, seemed to appreciate the view. Rick had been stationed at Epsilon-9 for 6 months, now assigned as Earth's military liaison of the Joint Research Project. The Galactic Alliance had insisted on human oversight for this particular venture. Something about ensuring ethical protocols. In reality, it was just politics. Humans or the new kids on the galactic block, and everyone wanted to keep tabs on them. He paused at a doorway marked Xenobiological Augmentation Lab and pressed his palm against the scanner. The door slid open with a soft hiss. Liona Kyara, you called for assistance, he called out, stepping into the laboratory. The lab was a marvel of alien technology, sleek consoles with holographic displays, equipment that defied Earth's understanding of physics, and in the center of it all stood Liona Kyara, the station's lead xenobiologist. Liona turned at the sound of his voice, her bright blue eyes widening slightly. She was a Threa humanoid species with smooth violet skin that seemed to shimmer under the lab's lights. Her long white hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, though a few strands had escaped to frame her delicate face. The brown scientific uniform she wore hugged her curves in a way that made Rick momentarily forget his professional demeanor. Commander O'Gorman Korshis, said her melodic voice, carrying a hint of an accent. Thank you for coming so quickly. I need assistance calibrating this new equipment. Rick approached the workstation, where Liona stood. What seems to be the problem? The Galactic Council sent this prototype device for our research, she explained, gesturing to what looked like a futuristic remote control sitting on the table. It's designed to temporarily alter cellular structures for medical purposes, but the instructions are incomplete. Rick picked up the device, turning it over in his hands. It was lighter than it looked, with a series of unmarked buttons and a small display screen. No labels. That seems like poor design. Lion's lips curved into a smile. The council believes in intuitive interfaces. Unfortunately, human and Thay intuition differ significantly. So what do you need me to do? Rick asked, still examining the device. I need you to hold it steady while I connect it to our main system for programming, Liona said, reaching for a cable. Just don't press any too late. Rick's thumb had already pressed a small blue button on the side of the device. A soft hum filled the air, and a beam of pale light shot out, enveloping Liona. For a brief moment, buttons, she finished, her voice suddenly higher pitched. The light faded, and Rick looked up from the device to apologize, only for the words to die in his throat. Liona stood frozen, her eyes wide with shock and mortification, as her already generous chest began to expand beneath her uniform. The fabric strained visibly, seams creaking in protest, as her bust grew to absolutely incredible proportions in a matter of seconds. What did you do? Liona gasped, her violet skin darkening with what Rick recognized as a thigh blush. Her hands flew to her chest, running over the newly enhanced curves. In disbelief, Rick stared at the device in his hand, then back at Liona. I think I found the cellular alteration function. Leona's blush deepened to an almost indigo shade. Commander O'Gorman, this is not amusing. She tried to cross her arms over her chest, but the new dimensions made the gesture impossible. Rick bit his lip, fighting back the grin that threatened to break across his face. I'm sorry, Dr. Kyara. It was an accident. He looked down at the device again. There must be a reverse button on this thing. There better be. Liona hissed, still trying to adjust her uniform to accommodate her new proportions. The department heads are meeting in 2 hours, and I cannot attend looking like you've been significantly upgraded. Rick suggested, unable to keep the amusement from his voice. Leona shot him a glare that could have melted to steel. This is precisely why humans have a reputation for immaturity. Just fix it. Rick cleared his throat, trying to focus on the device, rather than on Leona's transformed figure. Right. Let's see. He began pressing different buttons, but nothing seemed to happen. Stop. Leona grabbed his wrist. You might make it worse. We need to understand how it works first. Do you have the technical specifications anywhere? Rick asked. Setting the device down carefully, Leona nodded, moving to a console. Her movement caused her enhanced assets to bounce dramatically, and she winced, placing a steadying hand against them. This is so humiliating, she muttered. Look on the bright side, Rick said, following her to the console. At least no one else was here to see it happen. Just then the lab door slid open. Dr. Kyara, I was wondering if you had finished the analysis of Dr. Krell. The station's Eruen physician stopped mid-sentence, his four eyes blinking rapidly as he took in Lona's transformed appearance. This isn't what it looks like, Lona said quickly. Krell's mouth opened and closed several times before he simply backed out of the room, the door sliding shut behind him. Rick turned to Lona with a grimace that could have gone better. Lona sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. By tomorrow, everyone on the station will know about this. Rick placed a hand on her shoulder. Not if we fix it before then. Come on, Dr. Kyara. We're two of the smartest people on this station. We can figure this out. She looked up at him, her bright blue eyes meeting his for a moment. Something passed between them, a connection deeper than their usual professional courtesy. You're right, she said finally. And please, under the circumstances, I think you can call me Leona. All right, Lona, Rick said with a smile. Let's get to work. And for what it's worth, I really am sorry about this. Leona's lips curved into a reluctant smile. I know you're Rick, though I suspect part of you is rather pleased with your handiwork. Rick felt heat rise to his face. That would be unprofessional indeed. It would. Lona agreed, her smile growing slightly now. Let's figure out how to undo your unprofessional mistake before anyone else sees me like this. As they bent over the console together, Rick couldn't help but think that this bizarre accident might just be the beginning of something. Neither of them had anticipated this. Is useless, Lona exclaimed, pushing away from the console with frustration. They'd spent 30 minutes combing through the technical specifications of the device, but the documentation was incomplete at best and deliberately obscure at worst. Rick rubbed his eyes, feeling the strain of staring at alien text. The Galactic Council really doesn't want anyone understanding how this thing works, do they? It's classified technology, Leona admitted, absently adjusted her uniform again. Her enhanced chest made every movement a challenge. Only a handful of scientists have clearance to know its full capabilities, and you're not one of them, Rick asked, raising an eyebrow. Lona shot him a look. I'm merely testing its medical applications, not reverse engineering it. She stood up, wincing as her movement caused another bounce. This is ridiculous. I can barely move. Rick tried to keep his eyes at a respectful level, but failed miserably. The sight of Lona's dramatically enhanced figure was simply too distracting. Her brown scientific uniform, normally loose in the chest area, now strained against her new proportions, the neckline dipping dangerously low. Maybe we should try a more direct approach, Rick suggested, picking up the device again. What if we just press the same button again? Maybe it toggles on and off. Luna's eyes widened in alarm. Absolutely not. What if it makes them even larger? I can barely stand as it is. Good point, Rick conceded, setting the device down. We need to understand how it works first. He studied the small display screen on the device. These symbols here, do they mean anything to you? Leona leaned over to look, inadvertently pressing against Rick's arm with her newly enhanced chest. Both of them froze at the contact, a sudden electric tension filling the air between them. Sorry, Leona murmured, her violet skin darkening with another blush as she pulled back slightly, but not completely away. Rick cleared his throat. No problem. His voice came Out huskier than intended for a moment, they remained close, neither making a move to increase the distance between them. Rick became acutely aware of Lona's scent, something like vanilla and exotic spices, and the warmth radiating from her body, the symbols Lona finally said. Breaking the moment, they appear to be indicating different modes of cellular manipulation. She pointed to one that looked like a spiral. This might be the reversal function. Rick nodded, trying to refocus on the task at hand, rather than on how Lona's finger brushed against his as she pointed at the screen. Worth a try. Should I press it? Leona hesitated, then nodded. Just aim it away from both of us, please. Rick pointed the device at an empty corner of the lab and pressed the spiral symbol. A soft hum filled the air, but nothing visible happened. Did it work? He asked, looking back at Leona. She glanced down at her chest, inside evidently. Not. Maybe it needs to be aimed at the affected area, Rick suggested, immediately regretting his choice of words as Leia's blush deepened. I suppose that's logical, she admitted reluctantly. But if you make them any larger, Commander O'Gorman, I swear by the 7 moons of Tiyaju that I will find a way to make you suffer. Rick couldn't help but grin. Noted doctor. He aimed the device at Lona's chest, trying to maintain a clinical detachment that was becoming increasingly difficult. Ready. Lona closed her eyes and took a deep breath, which did fascinating things to her already enhanced bust. Ready. Rick pressed the spiral symbol. The device hummed in a beam of light shot out, enveloping Leona's chest for a brief moment. When it faded, both of them looked expectantly at the results. Nothing had changed. Damn it, Rick muttered. Perhaps we need to understand the underlying principles better. White Senel said, disappointment evident in her voice. The device manipulates cellular structure at a quantum level. The effect might have a time limit, or it might require a specific sequence of commands to reverse. Rick set the device down again. How much time do we have before your meeting? Lona checked the time display on the wall. Just over an hour now. Not enough time to become experts in quantum cellular manipulation. Then Rick said with a wry smile. No. Leona agreed, returning his smile despite her predicament. I suppose I'll have to cancel the meeting, or Rick began, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. Or what? Lona asked suspiciously. You could borrow my tactical vest, he suggested. It might help conceal things a bit. Lona considered this for a moment. That's actually not a terrible idea. Rick unfastened his combat vest and held it out to her. The gesture left him in just his fitted black undershirt, which clung to his muscular torso in a way that caught Leona's attention. Her bright blue eyes lingered on his chest and arms before she quickly looked away. Thank you, she said, taking the vest. She slipped it on over her uniform, and while it didn't completely disguise her enhanced figure, it did make it like obvious. How does it feel? Rick asked. Heavy, admitted, adjusting the vest. But better than the alternative. Rick watched as she fastened the front clasps. His vest was far too large for her slender frame, but somehow she made it look good. There was something undeniably appealing about seeing her in his clothing. You know, he said, in some human cultures, wearing someone else's clothes is considered quite intimate. Lana looked up at him, her bright blue eyes meeting isn't he culture as well, she said softly, particularly a warrior's garments. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken tension. Rick took a step closer to her, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. And what does it mean when a Traxi woman wears a warrior's garments? He asked, his voice low. Leona didn't back away. It can mean many things, and she replied, protection, respect. She paused, her violet skin darkening slightly. Desire. Rick's breath caught in his throat. Lona, the lab door slid open with a hiss, interrupting whatever he had been about to say. They jumped apart as Dr. Krell entered, followed by the station's director, a stern-looking human named Admiral Harrison. Dr. Kyara. The Admiral set his gaze sweeping over her unusual attire. Derek Krell has informed me of an incident with experimental technology. Leona straightened, pulling Rick's vest tighter around her. Yes, Admiral. We had a minor malfunction, while calibrating a new device, a malfunction that apparently resulted in unauthorized physical alterations. The Admiral said, his tone disapproving, and Commander O'Gorman's involvement, as I requested his assistance with the calibration. Liona said quickly the malfunction was unexpected. Rick stepped forward. Sir, I take full responsibility. I pressed a button without understanding its function. The Admiral's frown deepened. This is precisely why protocols exist. Commander, the Galactic Council entrusted us with his technology on the condition that we follow strict guidelines. With all due respect, Sir, Rick countered, the device came with incomplete documentation and unmarked controls. It was an accident waiting to happen. Admiral Harrison SED, be that as it may, we now have a situation to resolve. Dar Krell, can you assist in reversing the effects? The Arterian physician stepped forward, his 4 eyes blinking rapidly. Oh, I can try, Admiral, but without proper understanding of the technology. I don't want excuses, I want solutions. The Admiral cut him off. Dar Kyara is scheduled to present our findings to the Galactic Council representatives tomorrow. She cannot appear. Like he gestured vaguely at Liona. This Lona's blush returned full force. Sir, Commander Gorman and I were making progress in understanding the device. With a few more hours you have until morning, the Admiral said firmly. If the situation isn't resolved by then, I'll have no choice but to report this incident to the Council. He turned to leave, then paused, and Commander O. Gorman, yes, sir, next time, keep your hands off equipment you don't understand with. That he left. Dr. Krell following behind him. As the door closed, Rick let out a breath. He hadn't realized he was holding well. That could have gone worse. Lona sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. How the Admiral thinks I'm incompetent, and tomorrow I have to face the Council representatives looking like this. Rick knelt beside her chair. Hey, we'll figure this out. We still have time. She looked up at him, vulnerability clear in her bright blue eyes. And if we don't, then I'll stand beside you and take full responsibility. Rick said firmly, I won't let you face this alone. Something shifted in Lona's expression, surprise, followed by a softening that made Rick's heart beat faster. Thank you, she said quietly. That's not what I expected from a human. Rick smiled. We're full of surprises. Their eyes held for a long moment, the interrupted tension from earlier returning with renewed force. Rick became acutely aware of how close they were, of the faint scent of her skin, of the way her lips parted slightly as she looked at him. We should get back to work, Lona finally said, though she made no move to increase the distance between them. We should. Rick agreed, equally motionless. Neither of them moved for what felt like an eternity, caught in a moment of possibility that hung in the air between them like a tangible thing. The station's lighting dimmed to its night cycle setting, casting the lab in a soft blue glow. Most of the crew had retired to their quarters, leaving the research wing eerily quiet. Rick Glan aimed at the time display, 237 station standard time. They'd been working for hours. With little progress. Coffee, he offered, holding out a steaming mug to Liona. He'd made a quick trip to the mess hall, returning with provisions for what was clearly going to be an all-nighter. Al accepted the mug gratefully, her fingers brushing against his. Thank you, though I'm not sure how much more technical documentation I can read before my eyes start bleeding. Rick chuckled, pulling up a chair beside her as he discarded his undershirt hours ago, when the environmental controls had malfunctioned again, leaving the lab uncomfortably warm. Now clad only in his standard issue military pants, he was acutely aware of Lona's occasional glances at his bare torso. We've been approaching this all wrong, he said, taking a sip of his own coffee. We're trying to understand alien technology using human and thigh logic. Al raised an eyebrow. And what would you suggest? Instead, let's think about who designed this thing. The Galactic Council is primarily composed of Arcturians and Solarians, right? Their approach to technology is fundamentally different from ours. Lena nodded, slowly setting down her mug. She'd removed Rick's tactical vest earlier, finding it too cumbersome for detailed work now. She'd modified her uniform by fashioning a makeshift support from some spare fabric, which helped but didn't completely solve her predicamendarian's view technology. Is an extension of biological processes. She mused, and Solarians are obsessed with symmetry and balance. Rick snapped his fingers. Exactly so. What if the device doesn't have a simple undo function? What if it's designed to create equilibrium? Lona's bright blue eyes widened with understanding. You think it's not about reversing the effect, but balancing it with something else worth a shot, Rick said, picking up the device again. Though I'm not sure what the balancing factor would be. Lona stood and paced the lab, her enhanced figure swaying with each step. Rick tried not to stare, but the sight was mesmerizing. She seemed lost in thought, muttering to herself in her native Thai language, a melodic stream of sounds that reminded Rick of flowing water in Arcturian medicine. She finally said, turning back to him, "They believe in the principle of reciprocal transformation. To heal one part of the body, you must first understand its relationship to other parts." Rick stood, excitement building. So the device might need to understand what it's balancing against. It needs a reference point, a baseline. Yes, Elle exclaimed, it needs to scan an unaltered body to understand what normal looks like for my species. Do we have any other Traxi on the station who could serve as a reference? Or Rick asked. Leona shook her head. I'm the only one. But she hesitated, a blush darkening her violet skin. The device has already scanned me. Once it might have stored my original parameters. Rick examined the device more carefully. There's some kind of memory function here. These symbols look like storage units. He pressed a sequence of buttons in the small screen displayed what appeared to be a three-dimensional model of Leona. Before the enhancement, that's it. Leona moved closer, leaning over his shoulder. To see her proximity sent a wave of warmth through Rick's body. It stored my original cellular structure, so we just need to tell it to revert to the stored template, Rick said, his voice slightly husky from her nearness. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither spoke. The soft blue lighting cast shadows across Leona's features, highlighting the delicate curve of her cheekbones and the fullness of her lips. Rick was suddenly very aware of how alone they were. Rick, Lona said softly, not moving away, "There's something I should tell you about Tarxi physiology." "What's that?" he asked, equally quiet. "Our emotional states affect our physical responses much more dramatically than in humans. When we're attracted to someone, certain physiological changes occur." Rick swallowed. "Like what?" Lona's blush deepened. "Our skin becomes more sensitive to touch, our body temperature rises, and our pheromone production increases significantly." "Are you saying?" Rick began, hardly daring to believe what she was implying. "I'm saying that I've been experiencing these changes since we started working together tonight," Leona admitted. "And I believe you've been responding to my pheromones, even if you weren't consciously aware of it." Rick's heart raced. "Is that why I haven't been able to stop thinking about how beautiful you are, even in the middle of this crisis?" Lona's eyes widened slightly at his boldness. "Possibly, though I suspect that has more to do with your human directness than my pheromones." "Is it working?" Rick asked with a small smile. "Is what working?" "My human directness." Leona laughed softly, the sound like music to Rick's ears, more effectively than you might imagine. "Commander." The tension between them shifted, becoming something electric and irresistible. Rick reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, and brushed a strand of white hair from her face. Her skin was warm beneath his fingertips, and she leaned into his touch, almost imperceptibly. "In Thexi culture," she murmured, "this would be considered quite forward." "And in human culture," Rick replied, "this would be considered taking things very slowly." Lona's lips curved into a smile. "Perhaps we should find a middle ground between our species." Approaches. Rick's hand moved to cup her cheek. "I'm open to cultural exchange." The moment hung between them, fragile and perfect. Then Lona closed the distance, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that started tentative, but quickly deepened with surprising intensity. Rick responded eagerly, his arms encircling her waist to pull her closer. When they finally broke Apart both were breathing heavily. Leona's bright blue eyes seemed to glow in the dim light, and her skin had taken on a faint luminescence that Rick hadn't noticed before. Your skin, he said. In wonder, tracing a finger along her arm, its glowing. Lona looked down at herself. In surprise, it's unusual. It typically only happens during moments of intense emotion. She looked back up at him, a mixture of vulnerability and desire in her eyes I haven't experienced. This response before. Is it a good thing? Rick asked, suddenly concerned. Very good, Laura assured him, her hands resting on his bare chest. It means my body recognizes a compatible mate. The word mate sent a thrill through Rick that was both primal and profound. And how do you feel about that? Surprise, Elle admitted. Threy rarely formed connections outside our species, but not displeased. Her fingers traced patterns on his skin, leaving trails of tingling warmth. How do humans typically proceed from here? Rick smiled, pulling her closer, usually with less talking and more of this. He kissed her again, more deeply this time, his hands exploring the curves of her body. With growing confidence, Lona responded with enthusiasm, her own hands mapping the contours of his muscular back and shoulders. The sensation of her touch was unlike anything Rick had experienced, a warmth that seemed to penetrate beyond his skin, connecting directly to his nervous system in ways that human touch never had. Your quarters are mine, he murmured against her lips. Mine are closer, Leona replied, her voice breathless. But what about the device? Rick reluctantly pulled back, remembering their predicament. Right. We should probably fix that first. Lona nodded, though she didn't move out of his embrace. Probably, though, Rick said thoughtfully, his hands still resting on her hips. I have to admit, I'm starting to appreciate the enhancements. Lona swatted his chest. Playfully, focus, Commander, fix first. Then she trailed off, her meaning clear. Yes, Dr. Rick said with a grin. He picked up the device, again, his mind now sharper. Despite the late hour, if we combine the stored template with the reciprocal transformation principle working together, they identified a sequence of commands that seemed promising. Rick aimed the device at Lena, his finger hovering over the activation button. Ready? He asked. Lona took a deep breath and nodded. Ready. Rick pressed the button, the device hewn to life, enveloping Leona in the now familiar pale light. When it faded, they both looked down at her chest expectantly. It worked, Lona exclaimed, her hands moving to her now normal-sized bust. They're back to normal. Rick set the device down carefully. Crisis averted. Lona looked up at him, her expression suddenly uncertain. And now that the crisis is over, do you still? Rick didn't let her finish the question. He pulled her into his arms, kissing her with all the desire that had been building between them. This was never about the enhancements, he said. When they parted, this is about you, about us. Relief and joy flooded Lona's face. Your quarters or mine? She asked, echoing his earlier question. Rick smiled, taking her hand. Lead the way, doctor. As they left the lab together, the mysterious device sat forgotten on the console, its screen displaying a message neither of them had noticed. Transformation, complete bonding process initiated. Rick awoke to unfamiliar surroundings, the soft purple lighting, the faint scent of exotic flowers, and the gentle hum of alien environmental systems. For a moment he was disoriented, until the memories of the previous night flooded back. A smile spread across his face as he turned to look at Leona, still sleeping peacefully beside him, her white hair SPL across the pillow like a halo, and her violet skin seemed to shimmer with a subtle luminescence. Even in sleep, Rick resisted the urge to trace the delicate patterns that adorned her shoulders and back. Markings he discovered were unique to each of Thexy. Like fingerprints for humans, last night had been extraordinary. The differences between their species had created moments of awkward fumbling and surprise laughter, but they quickly found a rhythm that transcended their biological distinctions. Lena's skin had glowed brighter with each touch, illuminating the room with pulses of light that matched her quickening heartbeat. Now, in the quiet of morning, Rick felt a contentment he hadn't experienced in years. Being with Liona felt right. In a way he couldn't quite explain. "You're thinking very loudly," a voice murmured in his mind. Rick jolted upright, looking around the room in confusion. Before his eyes settled back on Liona, she was awake, now watching him with amusement in her bright blue eyes. "Did you just," he began, unsure how to phrase the question. Liona sat up, clutching the sheet to her chest. "Speaking your mind?" "I believe I did." Her expression shifted from amusement to concern. He said, "That's not normal." Rick ran a hand through his short hair. "No, definitely not normal. I've never experienced anything like that before." "Neither have I," Liona admitted tartly. "Don't possess telepathic abilities. Can you hear this?" Rick thought, deliberately focusing on Liona. Her eyes widened. "Yes, clearly." They stared at each other in stunned silence for a moment. "The device," they said simultaneously. Rick reached for his pants, which had been discarded rather hastily the night before. The message on the screen, what did it say? "Transformation complete." "And some else bonding process initiated." Liona finished, wrapping the sheet around herself. As she stood, "I didn't think much of it at the time. I assumed it was referring to the cellular recalibration." "Apparently not," Rick said, pulling on his clothes. "We need to get back to the lab and figure out what happened." Liona nodded, moving to her closet to retrieve a fresh uniform. As she dressed, Rick tried not to stare, but found himself captivated by the graceful efficiency of her movements. "I can feel you watching me," her voice echoed in his mind, tinged with amusement. Rick felt heat rise to his face. "Sorry, still getting used to this connection." "As am I," Liona said aloud. "It's intimate in a way I wasn't prepared for." Once dressed, when they made their way through the station's corridors toward the lab, the morning shift was just beginning, and they passed several crew members who gave them curious looks. A human commander and scientist, emerging from the same core ERS at the start of the day, was bound to raise eyebrows. Everyone staring, Rick thought. "Let them stare," Liona replied mentally, a hint of defiance in her tone. "They don't share the human concept of shame regarding natural attraction." Rick smiled. "I'm starting to appreciate the philosophy." They reached the lab and found it exactly as they'd left it, the mysterious device still sitting on the console. Rick picked it up, carefully examining the screen. "The message is gone," he noted. "Now it's just showing standard diagnostic information." Liona moved to the main computer terminal. "Let me run a scan on both of us. If the device altered our neurophysiology, it should be detectable." Rick stood patiently as Liona passed a handheld scanner over him, then did the same to herself. The results appeared on the large screen above the console. "Fascinating," Liona murmured, studying the data. "It appears the device created a series of matching neural pathways in both our brains, specifically in the regions responsible for empathic response and communication." "Is it dangerous?" Rick asked, concerned. Liona shook her head. "Not from what I can tell. The changes are subtle but significant. It's as if the device built a bridge between our minds, using our existing neural architecture." "But why?" Rick wondered. "What's the purpose of linking us this way?" Before Liona could respond, the lab door slid open and Admiral Harrison entered. Both Rick and Liona straightened instinctively. "Dar Kyara, Commander O. Gorman on." The Admiral acknowledged. "I see you've resolved yesterday's situation." His eyes flicked briefly to Liona's now normal chest. "Yes, sir," Rick replied. "We determined the correct sequence to reverse the effect." "Excellent. Then you're prepared for the Council representatives' arrival this afternoon." The Admiral's tone made it clear this wasn't really a question. Liona nodded. "Of course, Admiral. All the research data is ready for presentation." "Good." The Admiral turned to leave, then paused. "By the way, the Council is sending a specialist in cynobiological technology. Apparently they're particularly interested in the device you were working with yesterday." Rick and Liona exchanged a glance. "We can't tell them about the bond." Rick thought, instinctively agreed. Liona responded silently. "Not until we understand it better ourselves. We'll be prepared to discuss our findings," Sir Liona assured. The Admiral, after Harrison left Rick, let out of breath that was close if he knew. What the device really did, he'd probably have us both quarantined for study. Liona finished grimly. In species neural bonding would be considered a significant security risk. Rick leaned against the console. So what do we do now? We need to understand the full extent of this bond, Liona said. Returning to the scanner data, the connection seems to be strengthening. When we first woke up, I could only sense your surface thoughts. Now I'm picking up emotional undertones. As well, Rick concentrated, focusing on Leona's presence in his mind. She was right. He could feel a warm current of curiosity and concern flowing from her, distinct from his own emotions. This is incredible, he murmured. It's like having a second set of feelings running alongside my own. Liona stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. The physical contact intensified the connection, immediately sending a rush of sensation through both of them. "Ooh-ho," Liona gasped, pulling her hand back. That was intense." Rick nodded, slightly breathless. "It's amplifying everything touch." "Emotion, desire," Liona added softly, her violet skin darkening with a blush. The air between them seemed to crackle with energy. Rick could feel Liona's attraction mirroring his own, creating a feedback loop that threatened to overwhelm his self-control. "We should probably maintain some physical distance while in public." Liona thought, her mental voice strained. "Probably wise," Rick agreed, taking a deliberate step back. "Though I'm already looking forward to exploring this further in private." Liona's blush deepened, and Rick felt a wave of anticipation. That wasn't entirely his own focus, she said aloud, turning back to the console. "We need to prepare for the council representatives and figure out how to hide this bond from them." Rick nodded, trying to direct his thoughts toward the problem at hand. "Can we block the connection somehow, just temporarily, while they're here?" Liona considered this. "Perhaps Traxi meditation techniques might help create a mental barrier. I could teach you the basics before they arrive." "Worth a try," Rick said, "though I have to admit, I'm not eager to disconnect from you, even temporarily." Liona looked up at him, her bright blue eyes soft with an emotion that resonated through their bond. "Neither am I. This connection is unprecedented, intimate, in ways I never imagined possible." "Is it common for Thray to form bonds like this?" Rick asked. "No," Liona replied, "we're a private species by nature. Even our closest relationships maintain certain mental boundaries." She paused, her gaze thoughtful. "Perhaps that's why the device affected us this way. It might have been designed to bridge the natural barriers between different species, a tool for diplomacy." Rick suggested, "creating empathy where none existed before." "Possibly," Liona agreed, "though if that were its purpose, why keep it so secret?" "The Galactic Council has been extremely protective of this technology." Rick frowned, a new thought occurring to him. What if it wasn't meant for diplomacy at all? What if it was designed as a way to control or manipulate other species? Create bonds with key individuals to influence their decisions? Leona's eyes widened. That would explain the security measures and why they're sending a specialist to check on it. "We need to be careful," Rick said, lowering his voice. "Despite their private mental connection, if the council discovers what happened between us, they might see it as a security breach, or worse, an opportunity to study the bond's effects." Liona nodded grimly. "They could separate us for research purposes." Some council members still view humans as a potential threat to galactic stability. This could be seen as evidence that humans are too unpredictable to be trusted with advanced technology. Rick reached for her hand, no longer caring about the intensity of the connection. "I won't let that happen, whatever this bond is, whatever it means. We'll face it together." The warmth of his determination flowed through their connection, met and matched by Leona's own resolve. For a moment, they stood hand in hand, minds intertwined, facing an uncertain future. With newfound unity, together, Liona agreed, silently squeezing his hand. "No matter what happens next, Commander O'Gorman, please describe your experience with the xenobiological modifier." Rick sat stiffly in the station's conference room, facing Council Specialist Thorne, a tall, slender human with unnervingly pale eyes, and an expression that suggested he'd never experienced joy behind him, stood two Arcturian security officers, their four eyes constantly scanning the room. As I stated in my report, Sir Rick replied carefully, I was assisting Dr. Kyara with calibrating the device. When I accidentally activated it, we spent several hours determining the correct sequence to reverse the effect. Thorns' thin lips curved into what might generously be called a smile. Yes, your report was quite thorough, yet I find myself curious about certain details you omitted. Rick maintained a neutral expression, though internally his mind raised. He suspects something, he thought, knowing Lona would hear him from her separate interrogation room down the hall. Stay calm, Lona's voice echoed in his mind. He has suspicions, but no proof. I can sense his frustration. This new aspect of their bond had emerged just hours before the council representatives arrived. Not only could they communicate thoughts, but they were beginning to share perception. Rick could borrow Lona's senses when he concentrated experiencing what she experienced, as if he were there. I'm not sure what details you're referring to, Specialist, Rick said aloud. Thorn leaned forward. The device records all interactions, Commander. It logged two distinct neural patterns during your calibration session. Care to explain why your neural signature was integrated with the device's functions? He's bluffing, came Lona's thought. The device doesn't have that capability. I would know. I've been studying it for months. Rick relaxed slightly. I was holding the device when it activated, sir. Perhaps it recorded my presence as part of its standard operations. Thorn's eyes narrowed. Perhaps he slid a data pad across the table, or perhaps you'd care to explain these anomalous readings we detected during this morning's station-wide security scan. Rick glanced at the pad, maintaining his composure. Despite the jolt of arm that shot through him, the scan showed two neural patterns with unusual synchronization. His and Lona's. Rick thought not everything Lona responded he's detected the synchronization, but doesn't understand its nature or cause. I'm getting fragments of his thoughts when he focuses intently. He thinks it might be some form of human-developed technology, a communication implant. Rick almost smiled at the irony. The council suspected humans of technological espionage, when in reality, they were the ones who had created this bond, however unintentionally. I'm not qualified to interpret neural scan, Specialist, Rick said, pushing the pad back, but I assure you neither Dr. QI nor I have any unauthorized technology or implants. Technically true. Rick thought their bond wasn't technology at all, at least not anymore. It had become something organic, integrated into their very beings. Thorn stared at him for a long moment. Commander, are you aware that withholding information about Galactic Council technology is considered a Class 1 violation? The penalties include permanent exile from Confederation space. I'm aware of the regulations, Rick replied evenly, and I've provided all relevant information about our interaction with the device. Rick, Lona's mental voice came urgently. They're asking about our personal relationship. They know we spent the night together. Rick kept his neutral, though internally he cursed. Of course, the station's security logs would show them entering Lona's quarters together. One more question, Commander. Thorn said, his tone deceptively casual. What is the nature of your relationship with Dr. Kyara? Tell him the truth Lona suggested about us, not the bond. I've sensed his thoughts. He's more interested in potential security breaches than in our personal lives. Rick nodded slightly. Dr. Kyara and I have recently begun a personal relationship, sir. It's not uncommon for station personnel to form attachments during long deployments. Interspecies relationships are discouraged by council policy, Thorn noted coldly. With respect, Specialist, Earth doesn't recognize that particular policy. Rick countered. The Federation's position is that consenting adults of any species and have the right to form whatever relationships they choose. Thorn's lips thinned further to typical human arrogance. You've been part of the galactic community for less than 50 years, yet you presume to challenge traditions established over millennia. He's trying to provoke you, Leona warned. Stay calm, Rick took a measured breath. I meant no disrespect to council traditions, sir. I was merely stating Federation policy. Before Thorne could respond, the door slid open and Admiral Harrison entered with Lona, close behind. Rick felt a wave of relief at seeing her both through their bond and his own emotions. Are you all right? He asked, silently. Fine. She replied, though I've had more pleasant conversations. Specialist Thorne Harrison said, his tone clipped. I believe your interrogation has exceeded the parameters agreed upon by the Council. And Federation representatives. Thorne stood slowly, merely being thorough. Admiral, the security of Council technology is paramount, as is the dignity of my officers. Harrison countered. Your concerns have been noted, but I see no evidence of any security breach. The device is functioning as expected, and Dr. Kyara's research continues to yield valuable results. Thorne's pale eyes flicked between Rick and Lona. Very well. But this matter isn't closed. The Council will want additional assurances that the technology remains secure after Thorne and his security detail left. Harrison turned to them with a sigh. That man is a bureaucratic nightmare. Are you two all right? Yes, sir, Rick replied, though I'm not sure what he was hoping to find. Harrison shook his head. The Council's been jumpy ever since that incident in the Proxima sector. Humans advancing too quickly for their comfort. He gave them a knowing look. By the way, your personal lives are your own business, as long as they don't interfere with your duties. Understood, understood. Sir, they replied in unison. After Harrison left, Rick and Lona exchanged relieved glances. That was close. Rick thought too close. Lona agreed. But I don't think Thorne is convinced. He'll be watching us. Rick nodded. We should head back to the lab. Continue as normal. As they walked through the station corridors, Rick became aware of something strange happening in his mind. Fragments of scientific knowledge he'd never learned began surfacing in his thoughts. Complex xenobiological principles and medical theories. Lona, he said quietly, I think I'm accessing your knowledge. She looked at him in surprise. What do you mean? I suddenly understand how cellular resonance affects neural pathways. He explained. I've never studied that. Liona's eyes widened. The bond must be deepening, allowing us to share more than just thoughts and emotions. Try to access something from my mind, Rick suggested silently. Lona concentrated for a moment, then gasped softly. Combat formations, tactical analysis. I can see them, feel them, as if I trained in them myself. They reached the lab and closed the door behind them, ensuring privacy. This is unprecedented, Lona said, excitement overriding her concern. The implications for interspecies understanding are enormous. Rick grinned. Not to mention the practical applications. You could understand Earth military protocols without years of training, and I could grasp advanced xenobiology in days instead of decades. It's more than just information transfer, Leona noted, moving closer to him. I can feel how you process the world, your instincts, your reactions. Her voice softened. Your desires. Rick felt a surge of warmth through their bond. Is that why I suddenly find thy poetry so appealing? I had a line from the Celestial Harmony running through my head earlier. Lona laughed, the sound like music to his ears. That's my favorite poem. My mother used to recite it when I was a child. Her expression grew thoughtful. This bond, it's not just connecting our minds, it's blending our very identities in some ways. Does that scare you? Rick asked, taking her hand. It should, Leona admitted. I value individual identity above almost everything else. To share so completely with another being. She met his eyes. But with you, it feels right. Right, natural. Even Rick pulled her closer. I feel the same way, like I found a part of myself I never knew was missing. Their lips met in a kiss that resonated through their shared consciousness, amplifying every sensation. When they finally parted, both were breathless. We should probably focus on work, Lona murmured, though her thoughts betrayed her reluctance. Rick smiled. Probably, though I'm finding it hard to concentrate with your thoughts. And my head, my thoughts. Lona raised an eyebrow. I believe those particular images originated with you, Commander Rick felt heat rise to his face. Fair point. I'll try to keep my imagination in check. He spent the next few hours analyzing the device, further their shared knowledge, accelerating their understanding exponentially. What might have taken weeks to decipher became clear in hours. As they built on each other's insights, it was designed for diplomatic purposes. Lion concluded studying the data they compiled to create understanding between species with fundamentally different perspectives. But the Council kept it classified because they feared it could be weaponized. Rick added the realization coming from their combined analysis. Forced bonding could be used for espionage or control. Lena nodded. Yet our bond form naturally triggered by the device, but shaped by our own connection. So what do we do now? Rick asked. Thorne will be back, and next time he might bring more sophisticated scanning equipment. Lion's expression grew. Determined. We have two options. We can try to hide the bond, which will become increasingly difficult as it strengthens. Or we can prove its value. While Norrick finished following her thought process, show that human-alien bonds could benefit the entire galactic community. It would be challenging, Luna cautioned. Many on the Council fear human integration precisely because of your species' adaptability and ambition. Rick smiled. Those same qualities helped us survive on Earth for thousands of years. And now they've led me to you. He took her hands in his. Whatever we decide together. Through their bond, he felt her love, a complex emotion that transcended simple human understanding, layered with thy concepts of spiritual connection and cosmic harmony together. Lona agreed, her bright blue eyes shining as two minds with one heart as they sealed their promise with another kiss. Both knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, Council politics, interspecies prejudice, or the unknown evolution of their unique bond, they would face them united. Their accidental connection, having grown into something neither would ever willingly surrender. And somewhere in the depths of the Devix programming, a message appeared briefly on his screen. Bond complete, harmony achieved.